In the summer of 1967, the Middle East stood on the edge of transformation. For weeks, the tension had been building, and the atmosphere was charged with fear, suspicion, and fiery rhetoric. Israel found itself surrounded by hostile neighbors, each one promising its destruction. Egypt had mobilized in the Sinai, Jordan had signed a defense pact with Egypt, and Syria, always aggressive, prepared to unleash its fury from the imposing cliffs of the Golan Heights. For years, Syrian artillery stationed on these high ridges had rained shells on Israeli villages in the fertile valleys below, turning daily life into a nightmare. Farmers worked their fields under the constant threat of bombardment, children ran to shelters at the sound of artillery fire, and the entire northern frontier lived in fear of sudden attacks. To the Israelis, the Golan Heights were more than just a piece of land, they were a dagger pointed at the heart of their nation. For Syria, however, the Golan Heights were a fortress of pride and power. Rising steeply from the valleys, the rocky plateaus stretched over 40 miles, covered with bunkers, trenches, minefields, and barbed wire. Military observers from around the world considered the heights nearly impregnable. Any force attempting to climb the steep slopes would face withering fire from above. The Syrians believed that their defenses would bleed Israel white before any soldier even reached the top. Syrian commanders, backed by Soviet advisors, filled the bunkers with machine guns, mortars, and anti-tank weapons, confident that this mountain shield would stop any Israeli advance. To them, the Golan was not only a defensive line but also a vantage point from which to dominate northern Israel forever. When the Six-Day War erupted on June 5, 1967, Israel's first priority was not the Golan Heights but survival on other fronts. The Egyptian threat in the Sinai Peninsula loomed largest, followed by Jordan's moves in Jerusalem and the West Bank. Syria, for the first few days, restricted itself mainly to artillery barrages, firing shells into Israeli villages as the war raged to the south and west. For those living in kibbutzim in the Galilee, the earth shook day and night from the thunder of Syrian guns. Civilians crouched in shelters while their fields burned, waiting for the Israeli army to respond. But in those early hours, Israeli commanders hesitated. To open a full-scale front against Syria meant stretching their forces dangerously thin, while Egypt and Jordan were still in the fight. Prime Minister Levi Eshkol and Defense Minister Moshe Dayan debated furiously, should Israel risk storming the heights, or should they wait until other enemies were neutralized? By the third day of the war, events began to tilt decisively in Israel's favor. The Egyptian Air Force had been destroyed on the ground in the opening strikes, and the Sinai campaign unfolded with stunning speed. Egyptian divisions collapsed, leaving behind wreckage and surrendering soldiers. In Jerusalem, Israeli paratroopers had seized the Old City, reaching the Western Wall for the first time in 2,000 years. Jordanian forces were retreating in disarray. Victory seemed within grasp on two fronts. Now, attention turned north. The question that loomed over the Israeli leadership was simple but daunting: should they strike the Golan Heights before the war ended? For years, Israeli civilians had pleaded with their government to deal with the Syrian menace. The memory of dead children from artillery strikes haunted the nation. Every time a tractor plowed the fields of the Galilee, the farmer risked being shot at from above. Many believed that unless the Golan Heights were taken, the cycle of terror would never end. On the other hand, some leaders feared the cost. The heights were heavily fortified, and an assault would mean climbing into a storm of fire. The casualties could be staggering. Moreover, international pressure was growing. The United Nations was already pushing for a ceasefire, and the Soviet Union threatened to intervene if Syria was attacked. For Israel, the decision was both military and political, a gamble with enormous consequences. On June 8, after much debate, the Israeli cabinet gave its approval. The army was to prepare for an assault on the Golan Heights. The generals, including Yitzhak Rabin and David Elazar, devised a daring plan. Instead of launching a frontal attack across the entire line, Israel would concentrate its forces on narrow sectors, smash through the defenses, and then pour reinforcements through the breach. The key was speed and surprise. Once the Syrians realized where the main blow was falling, it would already be too late. But the soldiers who received their orders understood what awaited them. They would have to climb steep slopes under fire, cross minefields, and storm bunkers bristling with weapons. The task ahead seemed almost suicidal, yet morale remained high. After victories in Sinai and Jerusalem, the Israeli army felt unstoppable, and the soldiers believed that this was their moment to secure the north forever. As the sun rose on June 9, 1967, the thunder of Israeli artillery opened the battle. Hundreds of guns roared in unison, pounding Syrian positions on the ridges. The earth trembled as shells exploded on bunkers, wire, and trenches. Smoke rose from the mountaintops, shrouding the defenses in dust and fire. Then the order came, the infantry and tanks would advance. Across the valley floor, Israeli columns began moving forward, engines roaring, tracks grinding, and soldiers crouched low as they approached the killing ground. The Syrians, stunned by the intensity of the bombardment, soon recovered and opened fire. From the heights above, machine guns spat bullets, mortars whistled down, and artillery shells crashed among the attackers. The valley echoed with the sounds of battle screams, explosions, and the relentless crack of rifles. Israeli soldiers pressed on, crawling through dirt, cutting barbed wire, and clearing minefields under fire. One of the fiercest clashes erupted near Tel Faher, a Syrian stronghold considered unassailable. The bunkers there overlooked the valley with commanding fields of fire. As Israeli infantry charged, they were met with torrents of bullets and grenades. Casualties mounted, but the attackers refused to break. Small groups crawled forward, hurling grenades into firing slits, blasting openings with explosives, and storming trenches in brutal hand-to-hand combat. The fighting was savage, with bayonets, knives, and even fists used when ammunition ran low. Soldiers dragged wounded comrades back while others pressed forward, determined not to leave the job unfinished. Slowly, bunker by bunker, the Israeli forces clawed their way up the slopes, seizing ground at a terrible cost. The ground was soaked with blood, but the momentum was shifting. As dusk approached, the first Israeli flags were planted on captured Syrian positions. Exhausted soldiers looked down from the heights they had taken, gazing at the Galilee far below. For the first time in decades, the fields and villages were safe from artillery fire. Yet the battle was far from over. The Syrians, though shaken, were not defeated. Reinforcements were rushing to the front, and many more bunkers and fortresses remained intact across the ridges. For the Israelis, the night ahead would be filled with uncertainty. They had won a foothold, but at great cost, and the decisive struggle for the Golan Heights was only beginning. The night of June 9, 1967, settled over the Golan Heights with an eerie silence broken only by the occasional crack of rifles and the distant thud of artillery. On the valley floor, Israeli units regrouped, tending to their wounded, repairing damaged vehicles, and preparing for the next assault. The soldiers were exhausted, many had not slept for days, fighting first in the Sinai or Jerusalem before being rushed north to face Syria. Yet, despite their fatigue, there was an unshakable determination in the ranks. They knew they were fighting not just for territory but for the safety of their families who lived under the shadow of Syrian guns. For them, retreat was unthinkable. On the heights above, Syrian commanders scrambled to assess the damage. They had been shocked by the ferocity of the Israeli attack. Entire positions that were thought to be impregnable had fallen within hours. Bunkers at Tel Faher and Tel Azaziat, fortified with concrete, wire, and mines, had been breached by relentless infantry assaults. For the first time, Syrian soldiers realized that their fortress could be cracked. Still, the Syrians were not ready to surrender the heights. Reinforcements were being rushed from Damascus, and new defensive lines were hastily organized. Orders went out to hold every inch of ground, no matter the cost. As dawn broke on June 10, the second phase of the battle began. Israeli artillery once again unleashed a storm of fire, hammering Syrian positions across the ridges. This time, however, the attack was broader, designed to smash the entire defensive belt. Columns of Israeli tanks, supported by armored personnel carriers, began moving forward once more. Their targets were new strongholds, the fortified villages and outposts that anchored the Syrian defense line. The terrain itself posed a challenge. Steep inclines, narrow ravines, and rocky ground forced tanks to crawl slowly, making them vulnerable to ambushes. From their elevated bunkers, Syrian gunners fired anti-tank rounds, hitting several vehicles in fiery explosions. Smoke and fire filled the valley as the Israelis pressed their advance. At the forefront of the attack was General David Elazar's Northern Command. His strategy was bold: push forward relentlessly, overwhelm Syrian morale, and break through to the plateau. But implementing this plan meant brutal, face-to-face fighting. At Tel Faher, where the battle had raged the previous day, reinforcements moved in to consolidate gains. Further east, Israeli paratroopers stormed Tel Azaziat in a bloody struggle that saw entire squads wiped out. Grenades rolled into bunkers, flamethrowers spewed fire into trenches, and soldiers clashed in desperate hand-to-hand combat. Survivors would later recall the smell of smoke, the cries of the wounded, and the sheer chaos of storming heavily defended positions. Meanwhile, Syrian soldiers fought with grim determination. Many held their ground even as Israeli tanks crashed through their wire and bulldozers cleared mines. In some cases, Syrian officers forced their men to remain in position at gunpoint, refusing to allow retreat. Yet, the psychological impact of Israeli air superiority was devastating. Israeli jets roared overhead, bombing artillery batteries and strafing convoys of reinforcements. Entire columns of Syrian vehicles were destroyed before reaching the front lines. Soldiers crouched in trenches looked skyward, hoping for their own air force, but few Syrian planes appeared and those that did were quickly shot down. By midday, the battle stretched across a wide front. Villages that had been turned into fortresses such as Banias and Kala were under heavy assault. Civilians fled in panic, joining streams of refugees heading toward Damascus. The roads were clogged with trucks, wagons, and livestock, creating chaos and confusion. For many Syrians, the war had turned into a nightmare. Families abandoned homes, fearing Israeli shells and bombs, leaving behind possessions that would never be recovered. For the Israeli troops advancing into these areas, the sight was surreal: empty homes, abandoned fields, and the remnants of a civilian population suddenly uprooted. Despite the chaos, the fighting remained brutal. At Quneitra, the provincial capital of the Golan region, Syrian troops prepared for a last stand. The city, with its administrative buildings and barracks, became a key objective for Israel. Capturing it would not only deal a symbolic blow but also open the road to Damascus itself. As Israeli forces pushed closer, Syrian defenses began to crumble. Commanders sent frantic radio messages to Damascus, reporting the collapse of lines and requesting reinforcements. The Syrian government, however, was already reeling. Reports of Israeli victories in the Sinai and Jerusalem had demoralized the leadership, and Soviet advisors in Damascus urged restraint, warning of complete disaster if the Israelis advanced too far. By the evening of June 10, the tide had turned decisively. Israeli armored units, despite heavy losses, broke through the final defensive belts. Soldiers who had climbed cliffs and crossed minefields now stood atop the Golan Heights, looking down on the Galilee below. For them, it was a moment of triumph and relief. The villages and kibbutzim that had endured years of shelling were finally safe. Families could return to their homes without fear of artillery raining down from above. But the cost was staggering. Hundreds of Israeli soldiers lay dead, and many more were wounded. Survivors spoke of comrades who fell beside them in the mud, of tank crews burned alive in their vehicles, of nights spent dragging the wounded under fire. For the Syrians, the losses were even heavier. Entire battalions had been wiped out, and thousands were killed, wounded, or captured. The Golan Heights, once thought to be impregnable, had been lost in just 2 days of fierce combat. The capture of the Golan Heights marked the final chapter of the Six-Day War. On June 10, 1967, as the guns fell silent, a ceasefire was declared. Israel now controlled not only the Sinai and West Bank but also East Jerusalem and the Golan Heights. The victory was total, reshaping the map of the Middle East. But as Israeli soldiers looked across the vast plateau toward Damascus, they knew that the war's consequences were only beginning. The triumph had brought security for the north, but it had also set the stage for future conflicts that would return to these same heights in years to come. For Israel, the capture of the Golan was both a relief and a warning. They had removed the immediate threat to their northern frontier, but they had also gained a new territory filled with uncertainty. For Syria, the loss was a national humiliation, one that would burn in the memory of its people for decades. The battle for the Golan had ended, but the struggle for the future of the Middle East was far from over. The morning after the ceasefire of June 10, 1967, revealed a landscape scarred by violence. The hills and ridges of the Golan Heights were littered with burnt-out tanks, shattered artillery pieces, and the bodies of soldiers who had fought with unyielding ferocity. Smoke still drifted from villages struck by bombs, and the air carried the bitter smell of cordite and fire. Israeli soldiers, some too exhausted to even remove their helmets, sat silently near captured positions. For them, the battle had ended, but the memories of the struggle, the sound of shells, the sight of friends falling would never fade. On the Syrian side, the shock was immense. The army had been humiliated, its proud defensive system crushed in just 2 days. In Damascus, the mood was one of disbelief. How could the fortified Golan, designed to withstand even the strongest attacks, fall so quickly? Syrian officials scrambled to control the narrative, blaming inadequate preparation, betrayal, or overwhelming Israeli air power. Yet ordinary Syrians knew the truth: the army had been outmaneuvered and outmatched. For many families, grief was immediate. Thousands of young men had been killed, and countless more were missing, presumed dead or captured. The war had left deep scars on the nation's soul. For Israel, victory brought a wave of national pride. The Six-Day War was hailed as a miracle, proof of resilience in the face of overwhelming odds. Newspapers published photographs of soldiers raising flags on captured peaks, smiling despite their exhaustion. In Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, crowds cheered returning units, showering them with flowers. But behind the celebrations, there was a sobering recognition of the cost. Over 700 Israeli soldiers had died across all fronts, and thousands were wounded. In nearly every town and kibbutz, families mourned their dead. The joy of victory was mingled with the pain of sacrifice. The capture of the Golan Heights also brought new realities. For the first time in 2 decades, northern Israel could breathe without the constant threat of Syrian artillery. Farmers could tend their fields without fear, and children could play in villages without running to shelters at the sound of incoming shells. The sense of relief was immense, but so was the challenge. Israel now controlled a vast and rugged plateau populated by thousands of displaced Syrians. Entire villages had been abandoned, their residents fleeing in panic as Israeli tanks rolled forward. The question of what to do with this land, whether to return it, keep it, or negotiate, would dominate Israeli politics for years to come. In Damascus, the loss of the Golan was seen as a national wound that demanded vengeance. Syrian leaders, particularly Defense Minister Hafez al-Assad, vowed that the defeat would not stand. The humiliation of 1967 became a rallying cry, shaping Syrian military doctrine and foreign policy. The government began rebuilding its army with Soviet support, purchasing new tanks, aircraft, and weapons in preparation for the day when the Golan would be reclaimed. Every Syrian child was taught that the land had been stolen and must one day be returned. The seeds of the 1973 Yom Kippur War were planted in the ashes of 1967. Internationally, the Six-Day War transformed the Middle East. The map had changed dramatically. Israel now held the Sinai Peninsula, Gaza Strip, West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights. This created both a sense of security and a new wave of hostility. Arab nations, shocked by the scale of the defeat, gathered in Khartoum in August 1967 to declare their famous three no's: no peace with Israel, no recognition, and no negotiations. It was a statement of defiance, but also an admission that the path to resolution would be long and bitter. For the soldiers who had fought on the Golan, the memories lingered long after the guns fell silent. Many spoke of the terrain itself as an enemy: the cliffs, minefields, and narrow gullies that turned every advance into a gamble. Survivors recalled moments of sheer terror: tanks disabled under fire, comrades killed by sniper shots, desperate charges through barbed wire. Yet they also spoke of brotherhood, of soldiers dragging each other to safety, of medics working under fire, and of the determination to keep moving forward no matter the odds. These personal stories became part of the collective memory of the war, shaping how future generations understood the struggle. Syrian veterans, too, carried scars. Some described fighting until their ammunition ran out, only to be captured by advancing Israelis. Others recalled the confusion of battle orders that changed by the hour, commanders cut off from their troops, and the sense of being overwhelmed by an enemy that always seemed one step ahead. Many returned home to shattered villages, mourning the loss of family and friends. For them, the memory of 1967 was not just military defeat but also personal tragedy. One of the most symbolic moments of the war came with the Fall of Quneitra, the provincial capital of the Golan region. Though lightly defended by the time Israeli forces arrived, its capture was a powerful symbol. The city became a ghost town, its buildings damaged by shells, its streets deserted. Israel held it as proof of victory, while Syria pointed to it as evidence of aggression. In later years, Quneitra would be partially rebuilt and then deliberately destroyed again during the 1973 war, becoming a monument to the ongoing struggle. The aftermath of the battle also raised difficult moral questions. What should be done with the displaced Syrian civilians? Should the land be annexed, returned, or held as a bargaining chip? For Israel, the strategic value of the Golan was undeniable. It provided a natural barrier against future attacks. Yet holding it also meant ruling over land that once belonged to others. The debate would continue for decades, unresolved even into the modern era. The memory of June 1967 would not fade easily. For Israelis, it was a moment of triumph against overwhelming odds. For Syrians, it was a bitter humiliation that demanded revenge. For the broader Middle East, it was a turning point that reshaped politics, alliances, and the very notion of security. The Golan Heights, with its rugged peaks and fertile valleys, had become more than just a battlefield. It was now a symbol of victory, loss, pride, and pain, all bound together in the story of one of the most dramatic conflicts of the 20th century. And as the world watched the guns fall silent, everyone knew one thing: the battle for the Golan Heights might be over, but the struggle for the future of the region had only just begun. The legacy of the Battle of the Golan Heights did not end with the guns falling silent in June 1967. In many ways, it marked the beginning of a new chapter in Middle Eastern history, one that continues to shape politics, strategy, and identity even today. What unfolded in those 2 days of battle was more than just a military clash. It was the reshaping of borders, the redefinition of national pride, and the beginning of an unresolved conflict over land and dignity. For Israel, the capture of the Golan Heights was both a relief and a responsibility. Strategically, the victory meant security for the first time in decades. From the 1940s until 1967, northern Israel had lived under the shadow of Syrian artillery, which fired from the high ground into Israeli villages below. Families had grown accustomed to sudden barrages, children diving for cover in shelters, and farmers abandoning their fields. The conquest of the Golan ended that threat overnight. For many Israelis, it felt like a long-awaited shield, a natural fortress protecting the north. But military security came with new political dilemmas. Israel now controlled a region that was once home to tens of thousands of Syrians. Villages lay empty, fields overgrown, and roads silent. Some civilians had fled before the Israeli advance, while others had been forced to leave. The question of what to do with this land became central. Should it be annexed, returned in exchange for peace, or held indefinitely? In 1981, Israel officially annexed the Golan Heights, but the world never fully recognized the move. Decades later, the issue still fuels debates in international politics. For Syria, the loss of the Golan was a wound that never healed. The defeat of 1967 was described in Damascus not just as a military setback, but as a national humiliation. Maps, speeches, and textbooks all pointed to the plateau as stolen land. Every Syrian child grew up learning that one day the Golan must be returned. The slogan "The road to Jerusalem goes through the Golan" became a rallying cry, symbolizing both the depth of the grievance and the determination for revenge. The humiliation of the war would later inspire Syria, along with Egypt, to launch the Yom Kippur War in 1973, a desperate attempt to regain lost territory and restore honor. The international community also faced a challenge in the aftermath of the war. The United Nations quickly passed Resolution 242, which called for Israel's withdrawal from occupied territories in exchange for peace and recognition by Arab states. But the wording of the resolution was deliberately ambiguous, leaving room for interpretation. Did it mean all the territories, or some of them? Could peace come without full withdrawal? This ambiguity ensured that the debates over land and peace would drag on for decades. Beyond the political debates, the human impact of the battle was immense. Families on both sides carried scars that could not be erased. In Israel, soldiers returned from the Golan as heroes, but many carried the invisible weight of trauma. Survivors often spoke of the nightmares that haunted them, the sound of artillery, the cries of wounded comrades, the sight of villages in flames. For Syrian families, the pain was even deeper. Many were forced into exile, becoming refugees in their own country, living with the knowledge that their homes and fields now lay behind enemy lines. Generations grew up with the bitterness of loss, their grandparents' stories keeping the memory alive. The Golan Heights themselves became a place of silence and memory. In some parts, old Syrian bunkers still stood, rusting and overgrown, visited by tourists and students who came to learn about the battles. Minefields remained, a dangerous reminder of the ferocity of the fighting. Memorials were built to honor the fallen, and each year, veterans and families gathered to remember the lives cut short in the struggle for the plateau. As the decades passed, the Golan also revealed its economic and strategic value. The land was fertile, producing vineyards, orchards, and pastures. Its waters, especially from the Jordan River and nearby springs, became vital for Israel's agriculture. The high ground provided a military advantage, but also a cultural one, a symbol of resilience, proof that Israel could not only survive but thrive against overwhelming odds. In modern times, the Golan has also become a point of international contention once again. In 2019, the United States formally recognized Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights, a move praised in Israel but condemned across much of the world. For Syria, still torn by civil war, the question of the Golan remains a dream deferred, a piece of land that embodies both the pain of loss and the hope of future restoration. Looking back, the Battle of the Golan Heights was more than just a military confrontation. It was a test of willpower, courage, and endurance. For Israel, it was a chance to eliminate a threat that had loomed for years. For Syria, it was a bitter defeat that reshaped its national identity. For the Middle East as a whole, it was a turning point that defined the course of politics, wars, and negotiations for decades to come. Yet beyond politics and strategy, the true heart of the story lies in the human experience. The young Israeli paratrooper who climbed the cliffs under heavy fire, determined not to let fear hold him back. The Syrian conscript who fought until his last bullet, believing he was defending his homeland. The families on both sides who waited anxiously for news, praying their sons would return. These are the threads that weave together the tapestry of 1967 threads of courage, sacrifice, pain, and resilience. As the sun sets over the rugged hills of the Golan Heights today, it casts long shadows over the battlefields of the past. The silence of the mountains hides the echoes of artillery, the shouts of soldiers, the cries of the wounded. But history remembers. The land remembers. And the world, too, must remember the lessons of 1967, that wars leave scars deeper than borders, and that the pursuit of land without peace is a road that leads only to more struggle. The Battle of the Golan Heights remains a reminder of both human strength and human fragility. It shows how quickly the tides of war can change, how courage can reshape destiny, and how loss can inspire generations to seek justice or revenge. It is a story that belongs not just to Israel or Syria, but to the entire world, as a lesson in the cost of conflict and the price of pride. And so, the story of June 1967 lives on not just in history books, not just in memorials, but in the hearts of all who were touched by its fire. The Golan Heights, once a battlefield, now stand as both a fortress and a question mark, waiting for the day when peace might finally replace the echoes of war.